Hey Reddit. I don't know where else to go with this, so here I am. I could really use some advice, or maybe just a place to unload everything that's been happening. I'm 34, and my wife, Rachel, is 32. We've been married for 8 years, together for 11. When we first met, she was this confident, outgoing woman who drew people in like a magnet. I was quieter, but I thought we balanced each other out. For years, I thought we had something real. But recently, things have been different. It started a few months ago. Rachel's always had a lot of friends, but she started going out more than usual, always meeting up with the girls or catching up with an old friend. At first, I didn't think much of it. I wanted to be supportive, you know? I mean, we all need time with our friends. But the frequency picked up, and it wasn't long before she was going out nearly every weekend and some weeknights too. When I asked her about it, she laughed and said I was being clingy, that she needed some space. That hurt, but I brushed it off. She had a way of making me feel like I was overreacting to everything, so I started keeping my thoughts to myself. Then she started getting secretive. She'd pull her phone closer when she got a message, leave the room when she took a call. If I happened to ask her who was texting, she'd get defensive, snap at me for spying, or call me paranoid. One night, as she was getting ready to go out, she dressed up more than usual, wearing this low-cut red dress I hadn't seen in ages. When I commented on how nice she looked, she gave me this cold smile and said, "It's good to feel desired every once in a while." Her tone stung, but I didn't want to start an argument. I was trying to convince myself that maybe I was imagining things, that maybe she just needed her freedom and that I needed to back off. Then came the night everything changed. She'd said she was going out with her friend Melissa for girls' night, and she'd be back late. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't argue. She left around 8 p.m., and I tried to keep myself busy watching a movie, trying not to let my mind wander. But by midnight, I still hadn't heard from her. I texted her, got no response, called her, straight to voicemail. Around 1:30 a.m., I finally gave up and went to bed. The next morning, she waltzed in around 10 a.m. with a big smile, looking refreshed, like she'd just had the best night of her life. I asked where she'd been, and she gave me this bored look and said, "Out with Melissa." We crashed at her place after a few too many drinks. Didn't want to drive. It sounded reasonable, until I got a text from Melissa later that day. She sent me a quick message thanking me for letting Rachel join her, saying it was nice to finally meet up, even if it was only for an hour. My stomach dropped. So Rachel had lied. She hadn't stayed with Melissa all night. And if she wasn't with Melissa, then who had she been with? I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to process, to figure out what I was going to do. I tried telling myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, that maybe she had stayed with a different friend, and that it didn't necessarily mean anything. But the doubt had planted itself deep, and there was no way to ignore it. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I couldn't just sit there and let her walk all over me. Something inside me snapped that day, a determination to uncover the truth. And that was just the beginning. After that morning, everything changed for me. I'd never been the suspicious type, but now every little thing Rachel did seemed like it had some hidden meaning. She'd laugh at her phone, roll her eyes at something on the screen, or take her phone with her to the bathroom. Each time, I felt this gnawing sense of dread. I didn't confront her directly yet. I needed more than just suspicions. I wanted something concrete. A few days after her night with Melissa, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I waited until Rachel was in the shower, then quietly grabbed her phone from the counter. I knew her passcode. She'd been careless enough to let me see it once, probably thinking I'd never use it. My hands were shaking as I unlocked her phone, half expecting to find nothing and feel guilty for even doubting her. But it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. She had a string of texts with someone named James. I'd never heard her mention a James before. I opened the conversation and immediately felt my stomach twist. The messages were flirty, casual, but intimate in a way that felt far too close for comfort. There were photos too, nothing graphic, but selfies of them together at bars, cafes, places she'd never told me about. In one photo, he had his arm around her, and she was leaning in close, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in ages. The messages were a mix of inside jokes, pet names, and plans to meet up. One text stood out to me: "Can't wait to see you this weekend. Make sure Dave thinks it's a girl's night again, winky face." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All those late nights, the secretive texts, the way she laughed at me when I'd ask where she was going. It all made sense now. She'd been lying to my face, using me as her convenient excuse while she ran around with this guy. The anger and hurt were overwhelming, but more than anything, I felt humiliated. How long had this been going on? How many times had she looked me in the eyes and lied? I closed her phone and put it back where I'd found it, just as she was stepping out of the shower. She walked into the room, her usual smug look on her face, completely unaware that I'd just seen the proof of her betrayal. For a moment, I almost said something, but I held back. I needed to figure out my next move, to confront her when I was ready. But the universe had other plans. 2 nights later, she told me she was meeting her friend Karen for a drink. She threw on a tight dress, did her makeup, and left without a second thought, barely glancing back at me. I sat there for a while, fuming, before deciding that I couldn't just sit around and wait for her to come back with another lie. I called Karen. "Hey Karen, it's Dave. Sorry to bother you, but Rachel said she was meeting you tonight. Is that true?" There was a pause, then Karen replied, No, Dave. I haven't seen Rachel in a couple of weeks." "Why?" The confirmation hit me like a freight train. It was one thing to read those messages and suspect, but to actually hear the lie in real time. It was infuriating. She was lying to me so easily, so smoothly, and didn't even care enough to cover her tracks. I thanked Karen and hung up, trying to steady myself. My mind was racing, but one thought rose above everything else. I needed to confront her. I'd had enough of the lies, the late nights, the smug little smiles as she slipped out the door. I was done being the fool, but I didn't want to do it at home. I wanted her to feel exposed, like I'd felt reading those texts, like I felt every time I watched her walk out with some excuse. So I decided to go to the bar she was supposed to be at with Karen. If she was with him, I wanted her to know that I'd caught her, right there, in front of him. I grabbed my keys and drove to the bar, my heart pounding the whole way there. I don't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the image of her face when she realized I'd seen through all her lies. When I walked in, it didn't take long to find her. She was at a table near the back, laughing with none other than James, the man from the photos. He had his arm around her shoulder, and they were leaning in close, completely wrapped up in each other. They looked like a couple, like they were the only people in the room. My stomach twisted with a mix of rage and heartbreak. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She hadn't even noticed me yet. She was too busy gazing at him like he was the most important person in the world. And for a second, I felt frozen, like I was stuck watching a scene from someone else's life. Then, something in me snapped. I walked over to their table, and when she finally looked up and saw me, her face went pale. She quickly pulled away from James, trying to put on a casual smile, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "Dave, what are you doing here?" I looked straight at her, my voice steady. "Funny, I could ask you the same thing. Weren't you supposed to be with Karen?" She stammered, her eyes darting between me and James. Karen had to cancel last minute, so James just happened to be here, and save it, Rachel." I cut her off, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I know everything. I've seen the texts, the photos. I know about your little plans to meet up. You've been lying to me for months." For a moment, she looked like she was going to deny it, but then something changed. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, and her face shifted into this smug, almost defiant expression. "Well, maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't need to go looking for excitement elsewhere," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The words hit me like a slap. I'd expected her to be embarrassed, maybe even apologetic, but instead, she was blaming me. Me. I'd spent years trying to make her happy, doing everything I could to support her, and this was her response? "So, that's it?" I asked, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. This is my fault? She rolled her eyes. Look, Dave, I deserve more than this. She waved her hand dismissively. You're predictable, you're clingy, and honestly, I'm tired of pretending that's enough for me. Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I'd never felt so humiliated, so completely discarded. But there, in that moment, surrounded by the sound of bar chatter and clinking glasses, something inside me hardened. I was done being her fool. Without another word, I took off my wedding ring, set it on the table in front of her, and walked away. I didn't look back to see her reaction. I didn't care anymore. As I stepped out of that bar, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I was finally free. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation, they still hurt, but they no longer had control over me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The following days felt surreal. Rachel's absence from our home became a constant reminder of the life we'd shared, the life she'd shattered so easily. Each morning, I'd wake up hoping this was some nightmare I'd eventually snap out of. But the silence around me, the hollow emptiness of our house, it was all too real. And then, of course, there was the bitter reminder that she was out there somewhere, probably with him, while I tried to pick up the pieces of the mess she'd left behind. But I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I needed closure, answers, something to make sense of why the woman I'd loved for almost a decade had turned into someone I barely recognized. So, after days of avoiding each other, I decided it was time to confront her face to face. I texted her, asking if she could meet me at a nearby cafe, somewhere neutral. She took her time to reply, but eventually, she agreed. I could tell she wasn't thrilled about it, but I didn't care. I needed to look her in the eyes, to ask her what went wrong, even if it meant tearing open wounds that hadn't even started to heal. The day of the meeting, I felt a mix of dread and determination. Part of me wanted to hear her admit what she'd done, while another part wanted her to deny it, to offer some explanation that would undo the pain. But deep down, I knew there was no coming back from this. I was hoping for closure, not redemption. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already there, seated at a corner table, scrolling through her phone as if she didn't have a care in the world. Seeing her sitting there, so composed, so unaffected, stirred something inside me. She looked up as I approached, her expression blank, maybe a bit annoyed, as if this whole ordeal was just an inconvenience she had to get through. "Hey," she said flatly, not even attempting to smile. "Rachel," I replied, my voice strained. I took a seat across from her, studying her face, trying to see the woman I used to love. But all I saw was a stranger, someone who'd chosen deceit and betrayal over honesty and respect. For a moment, we just sat there in silence. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken words between us thickening the air. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" She rolled her eyes, letting out a sigh that was almost dismissive. "I don't know what you want me to say, Dave. Things change. People change. We were drifting apart." "Drifting apart?" I echoed, incredulous. "You think that justifies sneaking around with someone else? You could have talked to me, Rachel. We could have worked on things, tried to fix whatever was wrong. But you didn't even give me that chance." She shrugged, looking almost bored. "And what would have been the point, Dave? You don't get it. I felt trapped, suffocated. You and this perfect little life, this routine. You were happy with it, but I wasn't. I wanted more, something exciting, something different." Her words stung, each one like a slap in the face. I'd always tried to be the kind of husband who provided stability, who made her feel safe and valued. And now she was telling me that stability had been the very thing that pushed her away, that I'd somehow suffocated her by trying to be there for her. "So you thought it was better to go behind my back? To lie to me? To make me feel like I was losing my mind? All for what? For excitement?" I was struggling to keep my voice steady, the hurt and anger boiling just beneath the surface. She looked away, tapping her fingers on the table, clearly irritated. "Look, Dave," I didn't plan for this to happen, all right? It just did. James made me feel alive, like I was more than just Rachel the wife. I needed that. And honestly, maybe you needed a wake-up call too. A wake-up call? I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. You think this is my fault? She shrugged again, unbothered. You've always been so predictable, Dave. You're a nice guy, sure, but sometimes nice just isn't enough. I don't know why you're acting so surprised. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, you would have seen this coming. The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless. Here she was, unapologetic, twisting everything around to make me the villain in a story where she'd been the one sneaking around. It was as if she couldn't grasp the impact of what she'd done, like my pain was nothing more than an unfortunate side effect of her new life. Rachel, I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice from cracking, I loved you. I built my life around you. And now you're sitting here, telling me that I wasn't enough, that I didn't entertain you enough? Do you even hear yourself? She finally looked at me, her eyes cold and dismissive. Maybe that's just it, Dave. Maybe I don't feel the same way about you anymore. I wanted something different, something more, and I don't regret it. Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. I felt like I was staring into a void, realizing that the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, was truly gone. She wasn't even trying to fight for us. She'd already moved on in her mind, and I was just a loose end she needed to cut off. For the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. I didn't need any more explanations, any more justifications. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I took a deep breath, looking her square in the eyes. Then we're done, Rachel. I'll file for divorce. You can have your freedom, your excitement. But don't come back to me when you realize that stability and loyalty aren't as boring as you think. She didn't flinch, didn't show a single sign of remorse. Instead, she nodded, as if she'd been expecting this all along. Fine. Maybe this is for the best. I stood up, feeling a strange sense of release. I was done trying to understand her, done holding onto the remnants of a life she'd already abandoned. As I walked out of that cafe, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a clarity that I hadn't felt in months. She'd made her choice, and now I was finally free to make mine. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Going back to the house after that conversation felt like walking into a mausoleum. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of the life Rachel and I had built together, a life that now felt like a cruel joke. Photos from vacations, anniversary cards, little mementos from our years together. They all mocked me, reminders of a love that I'd thought was real. I spent hours wandering from room to room, wondering how much of it had been a lie. Had she ever loved me, or had I just been a placeholder, the safe choice, while she waited for something better to come along? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that the woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted with my heart, was gone. That night, I started packing up her things. I couldn't bear to see them anymore, couldn't stand the constant reminders of what I'd lost. I filled box after box, methodically removing every trace of her from our home. It was cathartic, in a way, like I was reclaiming my space, taking back a life that had been overshadowed by her lies. As I packed, I found a small box of letters we'd written to each other over the years. Letters filled with promises of love, of commitment, of dreams for the future. I sat down, holding one of her letters, reading words that now felt hollow, empty. She'd called me her rock, her soulmate, the one person who made her feel safe and loved. But now, those words were nothing more than empty promises, reminders of a woman who no longer existed. In a fit of anger, I threw the letters into the trash. They didn't mean anything anymore. They were just remnants of a lie, pieces of a life that had been built on false promises. In the days that followed, I found myself reaching out to friends and family, people I'd unintentionally distanced myself from in my efforts to make Rachel happy. I'd spent so much time trying to be the perfect husband, trying to support her dreams, that I'd neglected the people who had always been there for me. I called my best friend, Mark, and told him everything. He listened quietly as I recounted the story, his voice filled with shock and anger. "Dave, man, I'm so sorry. I had no idea, but you didn't deserve this. She's the one who screwed up, not you." His words helped more than I'd expected. For so long, I'd blamed myself, wondering if I could have done something differently. But hearing someone else say that I wasn't at fault, that I didn't deserve to be treated like this, it was like a balm on an open wound. Mark came over that weekend, and we sat together, talking for hours. He reminded me of who I was before Rachel, the dreams and passions I'd set aside for her. He encouraged me to find those parts of myself again, to rediscover the man I'd been before my life had become wrapped up in someone who didn't value me. Little by little, I started to feel a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and the pain wouldn't disappear overnight, but I was determined to find my way back. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I started therapy, something I'd never considered before, but quickly realized I needed. Talking to someone who didn't know me, who could listen without judgment, helped me process the grief, the anger, the sense of betrayal. I also threw myself into activities I'd always loved but had put aside: painting, hiking, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in ages. Each day was a small step, a little victory in my journey toward healing. The divorce papers were finalized without much fuss. Rachel didn't contest anything. She seemed as eager to move on as I was. It hurt, knowing that she was so quick to sever our ties, but it also confirmed that I was doing the right thing. She'd made her choice, and now I was free to make mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. The finality of the divorce hit harder than I expected. Even though I'd been preparing for it, the reality of signing those papers, of watching the last legal ties between us dissolve, left me feeling hollow. Rachel had been a constant in my life for nearly a decade, and even though that version of us was long gone, a part of me still mourned what we'd lost. Or maybe I was mourning the person I'd believed she was, the person she pretended to be. In the weeks after the divorce, I focused on reclaiming my life, piece by piece. It started with small steps, like rearranging the furniture in the house, painting the walls a new color, getting rid of anything that reminded me of her. I wanted the space to feel like mine, a place where I could start fresh without the weight of our shared history. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon an old box filled with things from my college years: photos, sketches, notebooks filled with ideas I jotted down when I was young and idealistic. I hadn't looked at any of this in years. Somewhere along the way, I'd let go of my own dreams, focusing all my energy on supporting Rachel's ambitions, building a life that was more about her than it ever was about me. As I sifted through those old memories, I felt a strange sense of nostalgia mixed with regret. I realized how much I'd sacrificed, how much of myself I'd set aside, all for someone who hadn't appreciated any of it. I felt a surge of determination then, a promise to myself that I would no longer live for someone else. I would live for me and no one else. I signed up for a painting class, something I'd always wanted to do but had put off for years. Rachel used to call my art a hobby, something she dismissed as unimportant, but it had once been a passion, a part of me that I'd let wither away. Stepping into that studio for the first time felt intimidating, but it was also exhilarating. I could feel parts of myself waking up, parts one hadn't realized had gone dormant. At first, the paintings were just random, experimental, a swirl of colors and shapes that reflected the chaos I felt inside. But as time went on, I found myself pouring my emotions onto the canvas in a way I hadn't before. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, all of it found its way into my art. It was messy and raw, but it was mine, and it was real. In that studio, surrounded by strangers who didn't know my story, I started to feel like I was becoming whole again. I was no longer just Rachel's husband, or the guy who got cheated on. I was just Dave, a man rediscovering himself after years of living in someone else's shadow. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, like an old scar, still there, but no longer raw. I'd come to terms with the fact that the life I'd built with Rachel was gone, and I was okay with that. I'd started building something new, something that felt honest and real, even if it was a little broken around the edges. One evening, I decided to write down everything I'd learned from this experience, partly for myself, but also as a way to help others who might be going through something similar. I wanted to share my story, not as a warning or a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that even in the worst moments, there's a way forward. Here's what I came up with. Trust your instincts. Looking back, there were so many signs that something was wrong. Moments when I felt that gnawing doubt but brushed it off. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Trust yourself enough to dig deeper, to ask questions, to demand honesty. Don't lose yourself in someone else. One of the hardest realizations was how much of myself I'd given up to make Rachel happy. I'd built my life around her, let her dreams become my own, and in doing so, I'd lost sight of who I was. Don't sacrifice your identity for someone else's sake. Hold on to the things that make you you. You deserve honesty and respect. Rachel's betrayal was painful, but the lies hurt just as much. I realized that love without honesty isn't love at all. It's just a comfortable illusion. You deserve a partner who respects you enough to be truthful, even when it's difficult. Healing takes time, but it's possible. There were days when I thought I'd never move on, that the pain would always haunt me. But little by little, I found my way through it. Healing isn't linear, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. Give yourself the grace to feel everything, to process, to grieve. The pain won't last forever. Find something that grounds you. For me, it was painting, a way to channel my emotions into something creative. Whether it's art, music, writing, or anything else, find an outlet that allows you to process what you're going through. It's amazing how much healing can come from simply expressing yourself. Surround yourself with people who lift you up. Reaching out to friends and family, even after feeling ashamed and broken, was one of the best things I did. They reminded me of my worth, of the person I was before all of this. Sometimes, we need people to believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves. Forgive, but don't forget. This was a tough one. I don't mean forgiving Rachel in a way that lets her off the hook, but forgiving her enough that I could let go of the resentment, the bitterness. Holding on to that anger only hurt me in the end. I chose to forgive, but I'll never forget what I learned from her betrayal. You are enough. This might be the most important lesson of all. For a long time, I wondered if I was somehow lacking, if I hadn't been enough to keep her faithful. But I realize now that her choices were about her, not me. I am enough as I am, flaws and all, and I don't need anyone's approval to validate my worth. I posted those reflections online, and the response was overwhelming. People reached out, sharing their own stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and healing. Some thanked me for giving them hope, others offered words of encouragement, reminding me that I wasn't alone. It was a strange comfort, knowing that so many others had walked this path, that my story wasn't unique but part of a larger human experience. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found joy in small things again. A quiet morning with a cup of coffee, the satisfaction of finishing a new painting, the laughter of friends who'd stood by me through it all. I was still finding my way, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. One day, as I was walking through the city, I saw a couple sitting on a bench, laughing together, sharing a quiet, intimate moment. For a second, a pang of sadness hit me, a reminder of the dreams I'd once had. But then I took a deep breath and kept walking, realizing that I no longer felt defined by what I'd lost. My life was mine again, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I didn't know if I'd ever find love again, and honestly, that was okay. I'd found something more important, myself, and for now, that was enough. After the divorce and months of trying to heal, I found myself facing a strange but liberating question. What now? I'd spent so long as Rachel's husband, then as the man Rachel betrayed, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what came after. For the first time in a decade, my life was a blank slate, open to anything I chose. The realization was both terrifying and thrilling. I kept up with painting, joining a local art group that met once a week. It became something I looked forward to, a time when I could let go of everything and just focus on creating. The group was filled with people from all walks of life, each of them bringing something unique. There was Helen, a retired teacher who painted beautiful watercolors of nature, and Luke, a young guy who seemed to be rebelling against everything with his loud, bold abstracts. They quickly became my new circle, people who knew me as Dave, not as half of a broken marriage. One night, after our painting session, we all went out for drinks. It was a simple evening, filled with laughter, jokes, and random conversations. I found myself genuinely smiling, not just that polite, forced smile I'd been wearing for months, but a real one. Helen leaned over to me at one point and said, "It's good to see you laughing, Dave. You look like you're finally free." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a strange lump in my throat. Free. I hadn't thought of myself that way, but she was right. In that moment, I realized I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. I was just me, and that was enough. About a month after that night, I got a message on Facebook from an old friend, Melissa, who'd once been close to both me and Rachel. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. She kind of faded out of our lives when things between me and Rachel had started to change. The message was simple. "Hey Dave, I heard what happened. I'm sorry. If you ever want to catch up, let me know." I hesitated, but something in me was curious. Melissa and I had always had an easy friendship, the kind where you could pick up right where you left off, no matter how much time had passed. So, I replied, and we made plans to meet for coffee. When we met up, it felt like old times. We talked about everything, her job, my art, and eventually, the elephant in the room. She offered her condolences about Rachel and admitted that she'd had no idea what was going on. Apparently, Rachel had distanced herself from Melissa around the same time she started pulling away from me. "I always thought you two were solid," Melissa said, looking down at her coffee. "It's hard to believe she could do that to you." I shrugged, feeling a strange detachment. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, but I'm finally okay with that. I don't need to know why anymore. Melissa gave me a small smile. "That's good, Dave. You deserve to move on." There was something comforting about her presence, about reconnecting with someone who'd known me before everything fell apart. We ended up meeting a few more times after that, grabbing coffee or lunch here and there, and each time, I felt a little lighter. One evening, after a particularly nice dinner with Melissa, she suggested going for a walk. We strolled through the city streets, talking and laughing, until we found ourselves in front of an art gallery. They were hosting an open exhibition night, so we wandered in, curious. The gallery was filled with pieces from local artists, and as we walked from one piece to the next, Melissa nudged me. "You should show your work here someday. You've got a lot to say, and people should see it." I laughed it off, saying I wasn't ready for that, but her words lingered. It was the first time someone had shown interest in my art beyond the casual compliments. Her encouragement sparked something in me, a reminder that maybe I had more to offer the world than I'd ever realized. At the end of the evening, as we stood outside, saying goodbye, she looked at me with a warmth that caught me off guard. "You know, Dave, you're not the same person you were a year ago. I'm really proud of you." Before I could think, I leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tentative kiss that surprised both of us. When I pulled back, she looked up at me, her eyes wide, and then she smiled, a smile that felt like a door opening. It wasn't an intense, world-shattering moment. It was gentle, like a quiet beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the possibility of something real. My relationship with Melissa started slowly. We were both careful, taking things one step at a time, respecting each other's boundaries. After all, she'd known Rachel too, and neither of us wanted to rush into something without making sure it was real. But as the months passed, I found myself genuinely happy with her. She was kind, thoughtful, and saw me in a way Rachel never had. With Melissa, I didn't feel the need to prove myself or try to fit into someone else's mold. I could just be me, and that was enough. One evening, I showed her a painting I'd been working on. It was a landscape, simple but peaceful, a reflection of where I felt I was in life. She looked at it, then at me, her eyes full of pride. "Dave, this is beautiful. You should be proud of it." And I was. For the first time, I felt like I was living a life I was proud of, a life I'd built from the ashes of something that had once destroyed me. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from Rachel. It was brief and apologetic, filled with the usual regrets and acknowledgments of mistakes. She said she was sorry for hurting me, that she'd been lost and confused, and that she hoped I'd found happiness. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she implied it. Reading her words, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no anger anymore, no bitterness. I just felt removed, like I was reading the story of someone else's life. I'd already forgiven her in my own way, not for her sake, but for mine. Holding on to that resentment had only weighed me down, and letting it go had been the first step in finding peace. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not sure if I'd ever look at it again. It didn't matter anymore. I'd moved on, and that chapter of my life was firmly in the past. Today, I'm in a place I never thought I'd reach. I'm still painting, still exploring new parts of myself, and learning what it means to be truly happy on my own terms. Melissa and I are taking things slowly, but every moment with her feels genuine, like we're building something solid and real. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life doesn't always go the way we plan. Sometimes it breaks you, leaves you shattered, and you have to pick up the pieces on your own. But there's a beauty in that process, a strength that comes from rebuilding yourself from the ground up. To anyone going through a similar betrayal, I want you to know that it gets better. The pain won't last forever, and one day, you'll wake up and realize you're stronger than you ever imagined. You'll learn to love yourself again, to find happiness in the smallest moments, and to trust that you deserve something real. For a long time, I thought my story ended with Rachel, but now I know that was just one chapter. There's so much more to come, and I can't wait to see where this journey takes me.